It began on a Friday morning, December 5th, 1952. At first, Londoners thought it was just another winter mist, the kind that had wrapped the city in soft grey cotton since the days of Dickens. But as the sun struggled to rise, the air didn't turn white. It turned a sickly, bruised yellow. By noon, the sky had descended to street level. It wasn't just fog. It was a wall of choking, acrid darkness that tasted of rotten eggs and burning coal. The sounds of the city, the roar of traffic, the bells of the churches, were swallowed by the gloom. On the streets, the familiar red double-decker buses crawled at a snail's pace, reduced to ghostly shapes looming out of the murk. Conductors were forced to walk ahead of their vehicles, clutching makeshift flares or handkerchiefs over their faces, guiding the drivers inch by inch through a world that had suddenly gone blind. This was no romantic Pea Souper. This was the beginning of a suffocating siege that would turn the capital into a tomb. To understand how a city of 8 million people could be brought to its knees by the air they breathed, we must first look at the London of 1952. It was a city that lived, breathed, and ran on coal. The skyline was not defined by glass shards or steel skyscrapers, but by a forest of brick chimneys. Every terraced house, every semi-detached villa, and every tenement block was a small volcano, puffing smoke into the atmosphere from dawn until dusk. In the early 1950s, the Second World War was still a fresh bruise on the capital. Bomb sites were still common playgrounds for children, and rationing was a daily reality. The British economy was struggling to get back on its feet, and the government's solution was to export everything of value. This included our coal. The high-quality, clean-burning hard coal mined in Wales in the north was shipped overseas to pay off war debts. What was left for the people of London was a low-grade, dusty, sulfur-rich fuel known affectionately and bitterly as Nutty Slack. Nutty Slack was a mixture of small chunks, nuts, and coal dust, slack. It was cheap, it was plentiful, and it was dirty. When you threw it onto the fire in the grate, it didn't just burn. It smoldered. It hissed and spat, releasing thick, yellow-gray smoke that clung to the chimney pots. But in December 1952, with the weather turning bitter, nobody cared about the smoke. The open fire was the heart of the British home. It was the only source of heat in a house with single-glazed windows and drafty floorboards. To let the fire go out was a sin. To keep it roaring was a necessity for survival. But it wasn't just the domestic hearths that were poisoning the air. London in 1952 was still an industrial powerhouse. Unlike modern cities where factories are pushed to the outskirts, London's industry was woven into the fabric of the streets. Massive power stations like Battersea and Fulham and the newly commissioned Bankside, now the Tate Modern, sat right on the banks of the River Thames, in the very centre of the metropolis. These cathedrals of power burned thousands of tons of coal every single day, belching clouds of sulfur dioxide directly over the heads of the population. Add to this the railway network. The romantic image of the steam train was still a reality. London's great terminuses, Waterloo, King's Cross, Paddington, were hives of steam traction. Hundreds of locomotives idled in the sidings, their funnels adding their own dense, oily contribution to the canopy above. Londoners were used to this. They called it the London particular, or a Pea Souper. It was almost a point of perverse pride, a romantic backdrop for Sherlock Holmes stories or Victorian melodramas. A bit of fog was considered atmospheric. It was an inconvenience, yes. It made your collar dirty and made you cough a bit. But it was seen as the price of living in the greatest city on earth. No one was afraid of the fog. They had lived with it for centuries. They believed that once the wind picked up, it would all just blow away down the estuary, leaving the streets grey but breathable. But in the first week of December 1952, the wind didn't pick up. It stopped dead. The trap was sprung by a freak meteorological event. On December 4th, an anticyclone, a massive area of high pressure, settled directly over the British Isles. Usually, London's air is kept moving by the winds sweeping in from the Atlantic, churning the atmosphere and dispersing the smoke. But this high-pressure system acted like a giant hand pressing down on the city. The wind dropped to zero. The air became perfectly, terrifyingly still. This stillness created a phenomenon known as a temperature inversion. Normally, hot air from the city rises, carrying smoke and pollutants up into the colder atmosphere above, where they drift away. But on this night, the ground was freezing cold. A layer of cold, stagnant air formed at street level, trapped beneath a layer of warmer air higher up. This warm air acted like a lid on a saucepan. There was no way out. The smoke from a million chimneys, the exhaust from thousands of buses, the fumes from the power stations, it all rose up, hit that invisible ceiling of warm air, and was forced back down. It didn't disperse. It concentrated. Hour by hour, ton by ton, the pollutants built up in the narrow streets of London. And it wasn't just smoke. The water in the fog droplets reacted with the sulfur dioxide from the burning coal. In the air, a chemical reaction took place. The fog turned acidic. London wasn't just breathing smoke, it was breathing a diluted form of sulfuric acid. The lid was sealed tight, and underneath it, 8 million people continued to shovel Nutty Slack onto their fires to fight the cold, unknowingly feeding the poison gas chamber they were living in. By Saturday morning, the city didn't just slow down, it vanished. Visibility dropped from yards to feet, and then to mere inches. The familiar geography of London, the landmarks, the street signs, the shop fronts, was erased. People who had lived in the same neighborhood for 40 years found themselves hopelessly lost at the end of their own road, groping along railings and brick walls like the blind, counting the turns to find their front door. The transport network, the blood flow of the capital, clotted and died. Drivers of the iconic black cabs and red buses simply gave up. They abandoned their vehicles in the middle of the road, leaving them as meaningless islands of metal in the swirling grey tide. For the first time in history, the roar of London traffic was silenced, replaced by the muffled, shuffling sound of footsteps on pavement and the occasional, terrified shout of someone disoriented in the gloom. Even the underground, usually the safe haven from British weather, was not immune. The ventilation systems, designed to pull fresh air in from the surface, instead sucked the toxic smog down into the tunnels. Commuters standing on the platforms at Piccadilly Circus or Bank found the station filled with a thin, blue haze. The cinema screens became invisible from the back row. The smog was inescapable. It was a physical weight that pressed against the eyes and burned the throat, turning the simple act of walking home into a perilous expedition where a wrong turn could mean walking off a curb into the path of a creeping lorry, or worse, walking straight off the embankment into the Thames. The terror of the smog was that it didn't stay outside. It was insidious. It seeped through the cracks in the sash windows, under the doors, and down the chimneys. Inside the homes of London, a greasy, black grime began to settle on everything. Housewives would wipe a surface clean, only to find it covered in a film of oily soot an hour later. It stained the lace curtains grey. It blackened the mirrors. It even coated the food on the table. You could taste it in your tea. A metallic, sulphurous tang that coated the tongue. People began to improvise. They wrapped scarves around their faces, creating makeshift filters that turned black with soot within minutes. Chemists sold out of gauze masks, usually used by surgeons, but they were useless against the microscopic particles of sulfuric acid. The smog mask became the fashion of the week, a piece of cloth that offered psychological comfort but zero protection. But perhaps the most heartbreaking angle of the smog came not from the humans, but from the animals. That week, The Smithfield Club Show, a prestigious agricultural event, was taking place at Earl's Court. The prize cattle, huge beasts pampered by farmers from across the country, began to suffocate. Their large lungs were particularly susceptible to the smog that had filtered into the exhibition hall. Desperate breeders soaked sacking in whiskey and wrapped it around the cows' noses, hoping the alcohol vapors would help them breathe. Despite their efforts, many of the prize-winning beasts collapsed and died in their stalls, their lungs black and ruined, victims of an industrial poison they had never encountered in the green fields of the shires. As the weekend arrived, the smog tightened its grip, transforming London into a scene from a dystopian nightmare. Saturday, December 6th, and Sunday, December 7th, marked the descent into total chaos. The density of the smoke particles in the air reached levels that are chemically impossible to replicate in a modern city. Instruments at the National Gallery recorded pollution levels 50 times higher than normal. The sun was effectively extinguished. At midday, in the middle of the street, you couldn't see your own feet. The city underwent a terrifying blackout. It wasn't a power cut. The lights were on, but the light simply couldn't travel through the air. Street lamps were reduced to dim orange glows that offered no illumination beyond a radius of a few inches. The neon signs of the West End, usually the beacons of nightlife, were swallowed whole. Inside cinemas and theaters, the smog became a disruptor of culture. At Sadler's Wells Theatre, a performance of the opera La Traviata had to be abandoned in the first act. It wasn't because the singers couldn't sing, it was because the audience in the stalls couldn't see the stage. The smog had drifted in from the street, filling the auditorium with a thick grey haze that obscured the performers. Even the cinema projectors couldn't cut through the gloom. The beam of light from the projection booth hit the wall of smoke halfway down the aisle and scattered, leaving the screen a blur of shadows. London's entertainment, its distraction from the post-war gloom, had been cancelled by the weather. Under the cover of this impenetrable cloak, the rules of society began to fray. Crime in London spiked. The police were effectively blinded. A thief could smash a shop window, grab a handful of jewelry or radios, and vanish into the grey wall 2 feet away, invisible to any pursuer. Smash-and-grab raids became common. Women walking home reported snatch thefts of their handbags, the perpetrator nothing more than a pair of footsteps rushing out of the silence and disappearing just as quickly. There was a profound sense of isolation. The telephone became the only lifeline, but the lines were jammed. People stayed indoors, huddled around their radios, listening to the BBC for news, but the newsreaders spoke of the smog as a transport problem, a nuisance. They didn't yet know the truth. Outside the window, the world had shrunk to the size of the room. The silence was unnerving. The usual hum of the city, the distant trains, the shouts of market traders, the rumble of traffic, was gone. In its place was a heavy, dead quiet, broken only by the sound that would come to define the Great Smog, the sound of coughing, a dry, hacking, relentless cough that echoed from every house on every street. A chorus of 8 million pairs of lungs fighting for air. While the newspapers complained about delayed trains and lost football matches, a silent massacre was taking place behind the closed doors of London's terraced houses. It wasn't dramatic in the way a blitz bombing was dramatic. There were no explosions, no crumbling buildings, and no sirens. Death came quietly, sitting in an armchair by a dying fire or in a cot in a cold nursery. The smog wasn't just dirty air, it was a chemical weapon. As people breathed it in, the sulfur dioxide dissolved in the moisture of their lungs to form sulfuric acid. It literally burned the respiratory tract. For the elderly, whose lungs were already scarred by years of industrial grime, and for the very young, whose lungs were pink and new, it was overwhelming. They began to drown in their own fluids. The hospitals were the first to realize the scale of the horror. Casualties flooded into the emergency departments, but they weren't victims of car crashes or falls. They were gasping, clutching their chests, their lips turning a terrifying shade of blue, a condition known as cyanosis, caused by a lack of oxygen. But the tragedy was that the ambulances couldn't reach them. The visibility was so poor that the ambulance fleet was grounded. Nurses and doctors reported walking in front of the ambulances to guide them, but eventually, even that became impossible. Thousands of people were left to fight for breath in their own homes, cut off from medical aid by the very air they needed to survive. The morgues began to fill up. In a grim echo of the plagues of the past, the city's undertakers ran out of coffins. There was a backlog of bodies. Funeral directors had to borrow caskets from as far away as Oxford and Brighton. The florists of Covent Garden reported that they had sold out of wreaths and white lilies. The machinery of death was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of natural causes. At the time, the government and the medical officers dismissed the rising death toll as a flu epidemic. They couldn't, or wouldn't, believe that a bit of fog could kill. But the doctors on the wards knew better. They saw the black sputum the patients were coughing up. They heard the rattling chests. They watched as patients who had been chatting in the morning were dead by the afternoon, their hearts giving out under the strain of trying to pump blood through oxygen-starved lungs. It was a mass event, a cull of the vulnerable, happening in the dark, with the rest of the country completely unaware of the magnitude of the tragedy unfolding in the capital. It wasn't science, engineering, or government intervention that finally saved London. It was simply the wind. On the morning of Tuesday, December the 9th, 1952, a fresh, stiff breeze from the west finally punched through the stagnant air mass. The lid of warm air that had trapped the city for 5 agonizing days was broken. Slowly, reluctantly, the yellow wall began to crumble and drift away towards the North Sea. The sky, which had been a low ceiling of lead for nearly a week, lifted to reveal a pale, watery sun. Londoners emerged from their homes like survivors of a siege. They stepped out onto the pavements blinking in the light, their faces smeared with soot, their clothes reeking of sulfur. They looked at their city and saw it coated in a film of black, greasy slime. The smog had left its mark on every brick, every window pane, and every statue. The buses started running again, the ships moved on the Thames, and for a moment there was a collective sigh of relief. The Pea Souper was over. It was just another bad winter fog, or so they thought. However, as the air cleared, the registrars began to count, and the numbers that started to trickle in from the borough councils were terrifying. In a normal week in December, the death rate in London was predictable and steady. But in the week ending December 13th, the graph on the medical officer's wall didn't just rise, it spiked vertically. The initial official figure released was 4,000 extra deaths. To put that in perspective, that was more than the number of civilians killed in the worst individual bombing raids of the Blitz. 4,000 people had died in just 5 days, not from explosives, but simply from the act of breathing. And the tragedy was democratic. While it hit the East End slums hard, it also claimed lives in the wealthy avenues of Kensington and Chelsea. The smog didn't care about class, it only cared about lungs. The government's initial reaction was one of defensive denial. The Minister of Housing, Harold Macmillan, who would later become Prime Minister, was deeply reluctant to point the finger at coal. Coal was the lifeblood of the fragile post-war economy. It was our only major export. To say that coal was killing people was political suicide. The official government line was that the deaths were caused by a particularly virulent strain of influenza that had coincidentally struck at the same time as the fog. They tried to blame the weather, the flu, even the victims' own weak constitutions. But the public wasn't buying it. The undertakers knew the truth. They had physically run out of coffins. The florists knew the truth. They had run out of wreaths. And the doctors knew the truth. They had seen the blackened lungs and the blue lips of the victims. Later, Modern epidemiological analysis would revise the death toll even higher, estimating that the Great Smog eventually claimed up to 12,000 lives in the months that followed, as those with lungs damaged by the acid succumbed to pneumonia and bronchitis during the rest of the winter. It was a massacre that had happened in silence, covered up by the very smoke that caused it. The sheer scale of the death toll made the government's position untenable. You couldn't hide 12,000 bodies. The public outrage was palpable. For the first time, Londoners looked at their open fires not as sources of comfort, but as killers. The romantic notion of the London fog, the backdrop for Sherlock Holmes and Jack the Ripper, was dead. It had been replaced by the cold, hard reality of industrial pollution. Under immense pressure from MPs, doctors, and the press, the government was forced to act. An inquiry was launched, the Beaver Committee, which delivered a damning verdict. The burning of domestic coal had to stop. This led directly to a piece of legislation that would change the face of British cities forever. The Clean Air Act of 1956. It was a revolutionary law. For the first time in history, the government told an Englishman what he could and could not burn in his own castle. Smokeless zones were introduced across the capital. In these areas, burning raw, black coal was illegal. Households were given grants to rip out their old, sooty fireplaces and replace them with gas fires, electric heaters, or grates that burned smokeless fuel like coke or anthracite. The change wasn't instant. It took decades for the smoke to fully clear, but the effect was profound. The black crust that had coated London's buildings for centuries began to be scrubbed away. The stone of St. Paul's Cathedral, which had been jet black since the Industrial Revolution, was cleaned to reveal its honey-colored Portland stone underneath. The sunlight returned to the streets. The Pea Souper became a thing of the past, a memory that grandparents would tell children about, sounding increasingly like a ghost story. But the Clean Air Act did more than just clear the sky. It marked the end of an era of domestic life. The ritual of the coal fire, the coal scuttle, the poking of the embers, the gathering of the family around the hearth began to fade. It was replaced by the clean, invisible, but slightly soulless efficiency of the gas fire and central heating. We gained our health, we gained our lungs, but we lost the focal point of the British living room. The Clean Air Act was the death knell for the old smoke and the birth of the modern, regulated, environmentally conscious city we know today. Walk through London today on a crisp winter morning, and you will see a city that looks very different from the one that suffocated in 1952. The great stone monuments, once coated in a thick velvet of black soot, are now scrubbed clean, glowing white and honey gold in the sunlight. You can stand on Waterloo Bridge and see all the way to Canary Wharf in the east and the Houses of Parliament in the west. The air, though filled with the exhaust of modern traffic, is transparent. The great killer has been banished. But for the generation that lived through those 5 days in December, the memory of the smog is something that never truly leaves. It is a sensory memory. The taste of metal in the mouth, the sting of the eyes, and the terrifying claustrophobic silence of a city that had simply ceased to exist. They remember the fear of hearing a loved one cough in the next room and wondering if they would make it through the night. The Great Smog of 1952 was the final, deadly gasp of the Victorian age. It was the event that forced Britain to finally let go of its industrial past. We had to make a choice between the romantic, cozy tradition of the open coal fire and the right of our children to breathe. We chose the latter, and rightly so. But in doing so, we closed the door on a way of life that had defined the British home for centuries. We traded the hearth for the radiator, the flickering flame for the electric switch. We gained a cleaner, safer, brighter city, but we lost a certain atmospheric mystery that had made London unique. The Pea Souper is gone, relegated to the pages of Charles Dickens and Sherlock Holmes, and while we should never wish for its return, we should pause to remember the thousands who paid the ultimate price for our clean air. They were the casualties of a time when progress hadn't quite caught up with reality, ghost-like figures lost in the yellow gloom, reminding us that the clear sky above our heads was bought at a terrible cost.
We gained a cleaner, safer, brighter city.